They dumped the oak slabs behind Jack's barn like they were feeding a burn pile. The truck bed rose. Heavy slabs slid out in a cracking rush, hitting the mud so hard the old hens scattered from the fence line. The young timbermen laughed. One of them said, "That ought to keep the old man warm." Another said, "Maybe now he'll stop acting like that pasture road is worth something." Old Farmer Jack did not shout. He did not chase the truck. He did not wave his fists at the men standing by the gate. He walked slowly through the mud, bent down beside the first slab, wiped dirt from the cut face with his thumb, and studied the grain. The foreman laughed harder. "What are you doing, Jack? Counting firewood?" Jack looked at the pale oak, then at the laughing men. "No," he said quietly, "looking at tables." By sundown, half the county thought the timber crew had finally made a fool of him. But before harvest ended, those same slabs would become the tables that paid his overdue bills, filled his barn with orders, and saved the farm everyone thought he was too old to keep. Old Farmer Jack was 63 that spring, though the land had made him look older in some places and younger in others. His beard had gone gray. His hands were scarred from machines, wire, axes, frost, and more repairs than he could count. He wore the same brown cap most days, the same faded denim shirt, the same canvas vest with sawdust in one pocket and a carpenter's pencil in the other. Jack's farm sat at the end of a narrow gravel road with a leaning hay barn, a tired machine shed, and a pasture that still greened up after rain if a man gave it half a chance. The place had belonged to his father before him, and his father's father before that. But land does not care how long your name has been attached to it. Taxes still come. Feed bills still come. Broken tractors still wait. That year, Jack was behind on all three. The old baler needed parts. The south fence had fallen in 2 places. The county tax bill sat folded on the kitchen table under a coffee mug, as if weight alone could keep it from growing. Then the timber crew arrived on the neighboring property. They were cutting oak from the ridge beyond Jack's pasture, running trucks from dawn until dark. At first, Jack paid them no mind. A man cutting on his own side of the line was his own business. But then their trucks started turning around in Jack's pasture lane. Then the ruts got deeper. Then one morning, Jack found bark strips, chain marks, and tire tracks beside the old barn gate. He drove down in his tractor and told the crew boss to stay off his road. The boss was a man named Nolan Briggs, broad-shouldered, loud, and always smiling like he had already won the argument. "You barely use this lane," Nolan said. Jack kept both hands on the tractor wheel. "I use it enough." Nolan looked past him toward the pasture. "We could save half a mile cutting through here." "Then drive the half mile," Jack said. The younger men snickered. Nolan's smile thinned. "You old men sure do love saying no." Jack looked at the ruts in his lane. "No keeps a gate on its hinges." That was the part Nolan did not like. 2 days later, the dump truck came. Jack heard the engine before he saw it. He was in the machine shed, tightening a belt on the old farmel, when the sound rolled behind the barn, heavy, grinding, too close. By the time he stepped outside, the truck was already backing through the gate. The bed lifted. Oak slabs came sliding out. Long, rough, bark-edged pieces. Some cracked at the ends. Some muddy. Some thick enough that 3 men would have struggled to lift them. They landed in a heap behind the barn, right across the place where Jack usually pulled hay wagons through. Nolan stood by the truck with 2 young crewmen. "Left you some firewood," he called. A neighbor named Bert Henson had stopped his pickup by the fence to watch. Bert laughed and shook his head. "Jack, you going into the lumber business now?" The crew laughed with him. Jack said nothing. He walked to the pile. The slabs were rough. Too rough for a sawmill order, too uneven for a quick sale. But they were not rotten, they were not punky, and they were not worthless. Jack crouched beside the widest slab and rubbed his thumb across the cut face. Oak. Good oak. Pale, tight-grained, heavy. The kind that did not need to look pretty right away. The kind that only needed time. His father's voice came back to him low and steady from 50 years before. Rough don't mean ruin, Jack. Rough just means nobody finished listening. If you enjoy stories where old wisdom proves everybody wrong, subscribe to Old Farmer Jack Stories. Around here, the loudest men often miss what the quiet hands already know. Nolan expected Jack to curse. Bert expected him to complain. The young crewman expected him to haul the slabs to the burn pile. Instead, Jack stood up and said, "Leave them." Nolan blinked. "What?" "You dumped them," Jack said. "Leave them." Bert laughed from the fence. "You can't even move that mess by yourself." Jack looked at the slabs, then at the barn. "Not by myself all at once." That evening, after the truck was gone, Jack brought out chains, wedges, blocks, a pry bar, and an old come-along that had pulled more stubborn things than oak. He could not lift the slabs, but Jack had never trusted lifting when leverage would do. He moved the first one 3 inches, then 6, then a foot. He rolled one slab with a fence post, dragged another with the tractor, marked the cleanest faces with chalk. By dark, his shoulders burned. By midnight, one row of slabs lay under the open shed, raised off the ground with thin strips of wood between them. The next morning, Bert came back and leaned on the fence. "You really keeping them?" Jack sealed the ends of one slab with old paint. "Oak needs slowing down." Bert frowned. "Oak needs a match." Jack kept brushing paint on the end grain. "You dry oak too fast, it splits. Leave it wet. It twists. Treat it like trash, it becomes trash." Bert looked at the pile. "And if you treat it like treasure?" Jack set the brush down. "Then it has to prove you right." For 3 weeks, Jack worked around the slabs every day, morning chores first, fence repairs next, then oak. He cut away rot, trimmed broken edges, stacked the straight pieces, saved the twisted pieces for benches. He wrote lengths in an old notebook and marked each slab with chalk. He had no fancy kiln, no hired help, no new equipment, just an old barn, old tools, and the kind of patience that looks useless until it saves you. The first table began with 2 slabs that matched along the grain like they had been waiting beside each other for years. Jack pulled them into the workshop, one slow drag at a time. The shop smelled of old oil, dust, and wood shavings. A hand plane hung on the wall. Clamps sat in a row. His father's square lay in a drawer with a cracked handle. Jack had built gates. He had built feed troughs. He had patched wagon beds and porch steps and half the things neighbors only noticed when they broke. But a table was different. A table had to stand steady. A table had to invite people closer. A table had to hold weight without complaining. Jack squared the ends. He flattened the high spots by hand. He sanded until his fingers stiffened. He left one live edge because it still had shape, still had memory. Then he rubbed oil into the top with an old cloth. The oak changed. The pale grain deepened. Long, warm lines rose through the surface. What Nolan had called firewood began to look like something that belonged under a family's Sunday dinner. Jack stood back and let out one quiet breath. "That'll do," he said. The first table was not perfect. One leg needed shimming. One corner held a small crack. It was too heavy for one man to move easily, but it was strong and honest. And when sunlight came through the barn door, the grain glowed like the inside of wheat. That afternoon, Mrs. May Whitcomb came by to bring Jack a jar of peach preserves. She was a widow from 3 roads over, the kind who noticed when old men were eating too much canned soup and not enough real food. She stopped in the barn doorway when she saw the table. "Jack," she said softly, "where did that come from?" He wiped his hands on a rag. "Behind the barn." She stepped closer and ran her fingers along the live edge. "From that mess those boys dumped?" Jack nodded. May did not laugh. Her eyes moved over the wood and then grew wet. "My kitchen table was ruined in the flood last year," she said. "I never could find one that felt right." Jack looked at the table, then at the tax bill folded in his shirt pocket. He cleared his throat. "You need a table, May?" She looked up at him. "I believe I do." That was the first sale. Not a big one. Not enough to save a farm, but enough to buy the baler parts he had been putting off. Enough to prove the slabs were not waste. Enough to make Jack go back to the barn that night and look at the rest of the oak differently. If you've ever seen value where others saw nothing, let us know in the comments. Sometimes the thing people throw away is just waiting for the right hands. The second order came from May's nephew who wanted a bench. The third came from the church after someone saw May's table during Sunday dinner. Then a young couple asked for a long farmhouse table for the house they were fixing up. Jack did not call it a business. He called it keeping busy, but the notebook filled anyway. Name, size, deposit, slab number, finish date, delivery. By June, the back of the barn had changed. The burn barrel corner became a drying rack. The wall by the old harness hooks filled with clamps. The machine shed held more oak than broken machinery. Jack still fed the animals, still patched fence, still kept the farm all running with wire, prayer, and parts from coffee cans. But every evening, one more board became smoother. One more edge became useful. One more table came out of the pile those young men had dumped to shame him. Bert stopped laughing around the 4th table. He came by one evening while Jack was oiling a wide tabletop under the barn light. For a while, he said nothing. Then he laid his palm on the oak and shook his head. "I thought they buried you with this pile." Jack kept rubbing oil into the grain. "They did." Bert looked at him. Jack smiled faintly. "I just planted it different." By July, Jack had paid the parts bill. By August, he caught up on feed. By early September, he walked into the county office and paid the tax balance that had sat on his kitchen table all spring. The table money had not made him rich. It had done something better. It had kept the old baler running, kept feed in the bins, cleared the county tax notice, and pushed the overdue pressure off the farm before auction talk could start. The clerk looked over the receipt. "You selling cattle again, Jack?" "No." "Hay?" "No." She looked at his hands, dark with sawdust worked into the cracks. "Then what?" Jack folded the receipt carefully. "Tables." Good news travels in a small county faster than rain down a ditch, and it reached Nolan Briggs before the leaves started turning. He came back on a hot afternoon with dust on his boots and irritation in his mouth. Jack was planning a bench seat when Nolan stepped into the barn without asking. "I hear you've been selling my oak." Jack did not stop planing right away. The blade curled a thin ribbon of wood from the bench. Only when he reached the end did he set the plane down. "Your oak?" Nolan pointed toward the racks. "Those slabs came off my job." Jack wiped his hands. "You dumped them behind my barn. They were offcuts. You called them firewood. That doesn't mean you get to profit off them." Jack walked to the workbench and opened his notebook. He was not a lawyer. He was not a loud man. But he had been a farmer long enough to know that a man should write down what others might later pretend not to remember. He turned the pages slowly. April 18th. Nolan Briggs' crew dumped oak slabs behind my barn after being told not to use my road. Present were Nolan, 2 crewmen, and Bert Henson by the fence. Nolan's jaw tightened. Jack turned another page. Moved 13 slabs under cover. Sealed ends, numbered them, cut rot from 4. Built table from slabs 1 and 2. Sold to May Whitcomb. Paid tax on sale. Behind Nolan, the barn was full of oak. Tables leaned against the wall. Benches waited for pickup. A long harvest table stood in the center, glowing under the dusty light. The wood he had called waste now looked stronger than anything he had brought with him. Nolan looked around the barn. You knew what it was worth. Jack shook his head. No. I knew what work could make of it. For the first time since Jack had known him, Nolan Briggs had nothing quick to say. That was when Bert stepped into the doorway. He had come for a bench his wife ordered, but stopped when he saw Nolan. Bert looked at the tables, then at the notebook, then at Jack. Finally, he said, Nolan, you might have dumped the only honest work your crew ever left behind. Nolan's face reddened. The young crewmen were not there to laugh this time, and without their laughter, he looked smaller. He left without taking a single slab. If you're still rooting for Jack, subscribe now for more old-school farm stories like this. These are stories about old hands, old barns, and the wisdom younger men sometimes mistake for weakness. By harvest, Jack had orders written 2 pages deep. A church wanted a fellowship table. A restaurant wanted 4 small oak tops. A family wanted a table big enough for 3 generations at Thanksgiving. There were still sore mornings. There were still tools that broke. There were still slabs that warped and pieces that would not behave. But there was steady work. There was money in the account. There was no tax notice under the coffee mug. No feed bill folded behind the clock. No broken baler waiting for parts he could not buy. And the farm stayed in Jack's name. On the first cold evening of October, Jack finished the largest table he had ever built. It came from the widest slab in the pile Nolan had dumped. He did not sell that one. He set it in the old barn, right where the truck had dropped the first load of oak into the mud. Then he invited May, Bert and his wife, the young couple, the church deacon, and a few neighbors who had helped carry tables when Jack's back was hurting. They brought stew, cornbread, apple pie, coffee in a dented pot, and they sat around the oak table while the barn doors stood open and the fields went gold outside. For a long time, Jack did not say much. He only watched the table hold everything placed on it. Bowls, hands, laughter, stories, a receipt from the county office folded in his vest pocket, and the quiet relief of a farm that would not be sold. Bert ran his palm over the table and said, "Hard to believe this was dumped like trash." Jack looked at the grain, then at the people gathered around it. "Most good things look rough before somebody gives them time," he said. That was all. But everyone at the table understood. The young men had seen slabs too heavy to move. Jack saw boards waiting for patience. They saw firewood. Jack saw Sunday dinners. They saw an old farmer nearly finished. Jack saw one more season, one more skill, one more way the farm could survive. And in the end, the oak they dumped behind his barn became the tables that paid the bills, filled the workshop, and kept the old place standing. So when folks ask old Farmer Jack how a pile of discarded oak saved his farm, he never makes the story bigger than it was. He just runs one rough hand across the table and says, "They left me what they didn't understand." And that is the thing about old wisdom. It does not always arrive clean. Sometimes it lands in the mud. Sometimes it comes covered in bark, laughed at by fools, too heavy to move and too rough to admire. But in the right hands, what others throw away can still become strong enough to hold a future. Subscribe to Old Farmer Jack Stories for more tales about old machines, hard harvests, quiet grit, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from working long enough to know what still has life in it.